Hello, we are Group 4, and we are going to analyze Apple's complex relationship with one of its lead competitors, Samsung, and how this business decision has affected the company's supply chain.
Apple is one of the most successful companies in the world. Their laptops, phones, headphones, Apple Watches, and other accessories are used by people worldwide, and they continue to release new products every single year. Despite how successful they are, they actually rely on their main competitor, Samsung, to produce their screens for their iPhone. It shows that they're dependent on another company for their success, and in order for Apple to move forward and remain as one of the top technological companies, they need to sever that relationship and move forward on their own. The relationship that they have with Samsung does not allow them to control the prices of their iPhone screens, so they're kind of at the mercy of Samsung for the production of the screens. That relationship actually strengthens Samsung, so they'll always have a one-up on Apple.
Some of the core concepts to be taken from this class to be applied to this case are Apple's production model. They use a make-to-stock model. This is important because they don't make iPhones based on orders that are placed. They make iPhones to have in inventory and can disperse as they need as sales go. This gives them a little bit more flexibility to adapt production needs to the actual demand. Another concept is flow time. Any changes that are made to Apple's supply chain should be taken into account with regards to how long it will take to actually produce a single product. Inventory position. Apple is always negative at the release of their phone and becomes more positive as that continues. The reason for this is to help create demand initially when the iPhone comes out. By supplying less than demand, they enable themselves to look more exclusive. Sourcing. What's important about this is Apple procures products from others to develop the phones for a lot of its parts. For example, Samsung, as we discussed, does their screen. Other companies make their batteries. They use multiple suppliers. That ties into specificity because some of those parts cannot be substituted. Sometimes there's only one person that makes the part. Sometimes the competitors don't do a good enough job. Sometimes those competitors don't have enough capacity to actually take on those orders for Apple. The last concept we took into account when evaluating our alternatives was the bullwhip effect. As we increase suppliers and producers, demand has a larger effect on response time.
There are two main types of screens used for cell phones, LCD and OLED. OLED is more efficient because it provides its own illumination, whereas LCD screens are illuminated by backlight. Apple used to use the LCD, but now uses OLED, and Samsung uses OLED. Two factors that have impacted the sales for the companies are their marketing methods and data storage method. Apple utilizes a direct consumer approach, which creates a unique, memorable experience for the customer, where Samsung relies on channel partners to sell products and does not deal with customers directly. In terms of data storage, Apple is able to convert the customer to an Apple lifestyle because these customers must have an Apple account to use Apple products, where Samsung uses Google to handle its customer data. This adds another aspect that just separates Samsung from its customers, where Apple is able to connect with the customer better.
In this section about qualitative data, we're going to talk a little bit about the move from LCD screens to OLED, and then the eventual move from OLED screens to micro LED. So starting off with the LCD to the OLED switch. For smartphones, Samsung is the largest producer of the OLED screens, meaning that to keep up with the demands that Apple had, they had to go with Samsung. They made an attempt to utilize LG because LG is the largest producer of OLED screens for TVs. However, the production wasn't enough because they couldn't transition from the non-touchscreen TVs to the capabilities that were needed for smartphones. And at this time, Samsung was also producing their Galaxy Note 9, so their production was stretched incredibly thin by this increased demand. Apple is also currently working on moving from OLED to micro LED, and in this, Apple is working on the development of the technology, which other people are working on for televisions. They're currently developing for their smallest screens, which would be in their smartwatches, and utilizing it for touchscreen capabilities. And once they've gotten it for their Apple Watches, they'll move it up to their iPhones and they'll be outsourcing the production. That way it won't have negative impacts on their company if there are issues with production. In this section, we're going to go over the control that Samsung has over the OLED market, as well as the importance of iPhone revenue for Apple as a company. In 2017, 97.7% of all OLED phone screens were produced by Samsung. And because Samsung had such a large majority of the market share, they were able to charge Apple what they wanted, and they charged Apple between $120 and $130 per screen for a phone that costs $1,000. That's a large portion of the cost. And then Apple purchased 160 million OLED displays, resulting in $20 billion in revenue for Samsung, one of their main competitors. The iPhone is an incredibly important product for Apple right now. Last year in 2018, it brought in $166.7 billion in revenue. And as you can see in the graph, that's over 62% of Apple's total revenue as a company in 2018.
Apple is not the only company to have similar supply practices. Netflix uses a similar supply practice by using Amazon Web Services to actually store their customer data. However, the big difference that Netflix has is they actually use a subsidiary company called OpenConnect to stream their content from their library to the consumer. The major difference here is their most customer-facing aspect of their business is controlled in-house. However, they were able to use Amazon Web Services to lower upfront costs and risk when it came to other information that wasn't as important to the product. Samsung also used this practice by using two different camera sensors in their one model of phone. This was a huge issue though, because it did cause a significant difference in quality despite it being the exact same product. So customers would not know which version of the device they were getting. Though this did increase their production flexibility, the damage it did to their quality was not worth it. Other examples include Briggs & Stratton. They use Honda motors in their pressure washers for certain models. This is just to increase sales because some people want that Honda brand, but that makes it much more difficult for them to warranty, and their supply is more complicated because now they have to run two different lines. Saturn, which no longer exists, did a similar thing using a Honda motor because the Honda motor was the most reliable engine on the market. However, it did display that they had low faith in their own product, and it was difficult to maintain. Saturn, though, only used the Honda motor in select models, and other models still use Ford. However, this practice was ultimately unsuccessful as Saturn no longer exists. And finally, the last company to also use this was Microsoft and Xbox. They currently use Sony's Blu-ray technology, despite trying to use HD DVDs. The entire market switched to Blu-ray, so they had no choice in the matter.
One alternative that Apple can use is to develop screen technology within its own business. This would allow Apple to have more control of its production because it would rely less on its competitors. Also, having its own independence, Apple could work on its own technology at its own pace and potentially surpass its competitors. And eventually, Apple would have higher margins for its phones. However, developing its own technology would take a lot of time and complete. The company would have to finance overhead, labor, and research and development expenses. Another option Apple could take is to find a different companies to supply it with screens. If Apple can get a secondary competitor like LG or Sony, there may be more flexibility when negotiating contracts. It would also have fast implementation when creating phones because it would be working with a variety of companies. However, the problem with this alternative is that Apple would still be dependent on other companies. This could also lower the quality standards because the different companies would not be as advanced as Samsung is with screen technology.
Another process Apple could use is to adopt a model much like Saturn. They could use different suppliers depending on the product. This would allow them the consistency and reliability of a Samsung display and also be less dependent on Samsung by using Vizio, Sony, or LG to provide displays for their other non-flagship devices. The risk then of using a new supplier is then displaced off their main product. The downside to this option is there is going to be some risk with quality, and it's going to be a little bit more complicated of a supply flow, which does inherently increase the throughput time. and it makes them dependent on multiple companies. The final way is they could adopt the model that Samsung used for the Galaxy S7. This would increase their production flexibility by using multiple different suppliers for each device, thus reducing their throughput time, gives them more options, fast implementation, and reduces their dependency on Samsung. However, as shown by Samsung, it does create a huge issue with product variance and quality control. Overall, the best action is going to be a combination of the plans described earlier. In the long run, it's going to make more sense for Apple to develop this technology in-house. By reducing suppliers and mainstreaming their process in-house, they're going to dramatically reduce throughput time. However, short-term, this won't work as it takes way too long to implement. In the short term, it's going to be in their best interest to use action plan number 3, where they use multiple suppliers depending on what model of phone they're making. Their flagship devices, they can still have that reliable quality where they're making a little bit less money because they are paying for the premium screen, but on their other devices, they can reach out and experiment and lower that risk of trying a new supplier. The only downsides that we can see is potentially Samsung could retaliate, but also by using multiple suppliers, it makes them less dependent on Samsung, so they have a little bit more leverage in that negotiation. The other suppliers may cause quality control issues, but again, as we said earlier, that risk is then put on not their flagship device, where customers are expecting a little bit less quality anyway. While it would complicate the supply chain, the potential gains and independence are well worth the complexity in the short run.
With these suggested supply chain changes, Apple can overcome some of their current obstacles and take a larger portion of the market and their profits. Thank you for listening to our presentation.